Good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Still awake? Enough coffee? It's good to hear. So today I get to talk about one disease, and only one disease. Usually I have these big overarching topics of trying to cover everything that I know in 30 minutes, but I get to focus on bacterial leaf streak today. And my goal in this presentation is I'm going to break it down to 5 questions. And the reason I'm breaking it down to 5 questions is I call this the more FAQs. What are the most frequently asked questions about bacterial leaf streak in wheat? So this is more or less the outline. So I'm going to go over identification and favorable conditions. And although that seems simple in some ways, I'm going to tell you the importance of why we need to identify before we can manage it. How does the pathogen survive? Why do we see it every year? Why do we see it in some cases we can't explain? I'm going to tell a little bit of background story on that. Going to go over some of what I call an endeavor I took on of how prevalent is bacterial leaf streak in North Dakota? What's the yield loss associated with it? And then can I draw any economic conclusions for why we need to start managing it? And then the last 2 things are on management. Importance of host resistance, and I'll probably say host resistance 10 to 12 times today, so that's your fair warning. And then the other question, can I spray anything? So many times when we see disease problems in the field, what is the first question that is asked? What can I spray? Okay, so there's the outline. And so let's just come along here. So identification, and I'm going to take you more of like a time series of events. So the very first symptom and sign for this pathogen, you're going to see water soaking. You're going to almost looks like a grease spot. So draw your attention to kind of the center of the leaf. On a nice dewy morning, you can actually see the pathogen rearing its ugly head, and that's the ooze. So you see these little crystalline structures in the middle of it. That is the ooze. So think about this. We're in North Dakota, or in Minnesota. You get a raindrop that hits that ooze, spreads out. Oozes again, raindrop spreads out. You can see how this pathogen can kind of build from a center focus, right? So something to kind of keep in mind. As the pathogen continues to grow in the plant cells, you start seeing more necrosis, you see some burning and yellowing, and eventually you might see some pretty ugly looking flag leaves. And when we get to this point is when I start getting concerned, because this is truly a flag leaf disease. Most of the damage we see with bacterial leaf streak is on the flag leaf, the most important leaf. So how bad can it get? We can see pockets where we're just past flowering, entering those dough stages, and our flag leaves are completely gone, right? That's the point where we sit there and we ask ourselves, what is it and why is it important? The other reason why it's important to separate this from other diseases is that if you're managing a bacterial disease, we can't spray a fungicide on it, right? So if you're thinking it's a fungal leaf spot and you spray it, it's not helping the cause. You're putting inputs in there that's not going to be able to manage that disease, okay? So that's where the identification comes into play for bacteria. The other symptom that you can see, and this will help kind of build the story on how it survives, is black chaff. And what this is you see those flag leaves, still looking pretty burnt up. They still have the bacterial ooze. They splash on top of the heads, and we get these purple to black linear lesions on the hull of the wheat plant. What that means is now that bacteria has moved up to the seed. Okay, so there's your forewarning that if it moves up to the seed, we know how this pathogen can survive from year to year. Just kind of and I'm going to dive into this more in the hands-on session, but the 2 common misidentification questions is what bacterial leaf streak looks like as opposed to tan spot. And the key factors that I point out, tan spot is going to be more of a bottom-up type of disease. You're going to see it early on in the season. Eventually, you can almost see it progress. Bacterial leaf streak, you may see 0 symptoms in the bottom leaves, and maybe you make that scab application at early flowering, you come back out a week later, and all your flag leaves are burnt up. That's a classic tale of what bacterial leaf streak can come in, okay? So canopy location. The other thing, just look at your variety susceptibility. That really helps narrows down what some possible causes are. Some favorable conditions, well, it has a very wide temperature range. That's why it's adapted to conditions like in Minnesota and North Dakota. 59 to 86 degrees. How do I interpret that? If we look at daily averages in May, June, and July, most of the time we're going to fall into that. So temperature is really not a factor. What I think drives most of it is high humidity and free moisture, and then crop injury. And crop injury in this case is going to be those severe thunderstorms, specifically when they start coming in at that flag leaf stage. So when we think of June, we're getting that saving rain. I'm also thinking about when I'm going to start thinking I'm going to see my first bacterial leaf streak, because those symptoms and events always tend to occur pretty well in a correlation. And I'll just keep mentioning it, flag leaf. That is when we often see it. So if you're out there next year and you have a beautiful looking wheat crop, which everybody has every year, because I'm just an optimist in this region, you may see this after that rainstorm, but just look at the flag leaf. That'll help with that. And unfortunately, once you see it, kind of let it ride it out. Next year, you can make those decisions. Okay, so how does the pathogen survive? So this is the next cornerstone. When we think about plant disease management or in management of any pest, really, we got to know a little bit more about the pathogen. And in this case, understanding how it survives. We know that weedy grass hosts are in play. We have some researchers at NDSU and Dr. Liu, and also in Ruth Delmackey's lab down at the University of Minnesota. They have found that this bacterium can survive on grassy weed hosts. How important it is, we're not quite sure, okay? We know it's a reservoir, but I don't think it's the reason why we start to see some of these bigger epidemics that blow up in the field. Just be aware that if you see it on a field edge, for example, where we often see some of those grassy weeds, that might be a reason why you may pick it up on the leading edge of a field. The most important one is seed. So going back to that black chaff photo, when the bacteria splashes up onto the head, that is how it's able to survive. So how well does it survive? We're a little bit dated in this area of research, and the research that was been done on this, I should say for wheat, this was done on winter wheat, was done in Arkansas, and it was done in a greenhouse with seed that was stored at room temperature. A couple different factors there, right? So how do I look at that? I don't know. I mean, there's probably some seed stored at room temperature, but I can count a lot of bins that probably aren't at 70 degrees, right? So does that impact it? Greenhouse conditions, given everything it needs. And what they found is that 4 to 24% transmit. And how you can break this down is if you have 100 seeds, 4 to 24 of them is going to carry them into the next year, when it's given everything it's needed from a perspective and conducive conditions on a susceptible variety. So what I'm saying is we have to learn a little bit more about how that looks up into the northern Great Plains. We often get questions about, can you test seed for presence of bacteria? And we're in a great age. We can pull DNA, we can quantify DNA just about on anything. And seed lots are no different. Dr. Liu in my department has developed a protocol. He has worked it out. And he was able to find that you can detect xanthomonas, or the bacterium, in seed lots. And just to kind of explain what this looks like, pulling a table from some of his results, the key thing to remember is the lower the value, the more bacteria. So a little bit inverse on this, right? So the lower the value, the more bacteria. Here's the level of bacteria, and then I have, at the time, the varieties that we pulled from a variety trial that had a natural epidemic. So resistance down here, more susceptible down here, okay? So what did we find? If I want to break this down, we can find bacteria in resistant varieties, and we can find it in susceptible varieties. If we want to look at kind of a general trend, we see a little bit more. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but we tend to see a little bit more bacteria on those susceptible varieties. The next stage in this is we detect it, but how does it apply into the field? That's our next step and our next challenge, because we can pull bacteria from every seed lot, for example, but is it going to be important for the next year? Those are the type of questions that we're starting to ask and starting to look into the next coming growing seasons, okay? So if you want to know about it, yes, we can detect it. It's just how do we take what we detect to something that's more applicable in knowledge? Most of my efforts, and I'd say in 6 months here, was I was trying to document the importance of this disease. And how I was able to do this is we have an IPM survey effort. We hire 6 scouts in North Dakota. We also started the effort into Minnesota as well. And their sole job is to visit, among other fields, wheat fields, and detect pest presence. For those of you that are familiar with the Crop and Pest Report, you may see these maps about scouting maps for disease and insect presence, for example. This is the data that I'm diving into. So I went back to 2015 to 2021. I think there was only like 7,000 data points, so it wasn't too bad. And then we looked at, for me specifically, those fields that were documenting bacterial leaf streak between flag leaf and late milk development. So in other words, I'm trying to target that time where we see bacterial leaf streak in the field. Once again, just saying flag leaf is our starting point. And there's 2 values. how prevalent, so how many fields you had bacterial leaf streak in, and how much was within a field, which I called incidence. So those are the two factors I took as far as documenting how much bacterial leaf streak was in the state. So what does it look like for the amount of fields, the percentage of fields that had bacterial leaf streak in these years? So higher the number, the more amount of fields across the years on the bottom. We see some trends here, right? So if you want to look as far as in the past couple years where it's kind of a high-risk time, 18 to 2020. But if you look at 2017 and 2021, we didn't find it. Anybody remember what happened? Drought, right? Dry weather. So if there's one thing that can really put a curb on bacterial spread, is drought. But I don't think drought is causing more problems on the yield end more than we worry about it as a disease management tool. So this kind of makes sense. The other thing I want to remind you that coming out of a drought year doesn't mean that you get rid of bacteria, right? You see that big jump in 18. Last year, we only found about 8% of the fields. I think this was a little bit less than I anticipated, which was good news for all the growers. But it's just to kind of give you an idea that these are ultimate survivalists. The other question is, we have diverse growing regions, and we think about bacterial disease, we think about water, we think about high humidity. How does it vary across the state? So I broke the data into 3 sections. So think of it as west, central, and east. And more or less to try to look at trends in the data to suggest, how many fields were we finding bacterial leaf streak. And if you want to go by it step by step, we tend to see some trends that even in western North Dakota, you could find bacterial leaf streak, a little bit less in central North Dakota, and eastern North Dakota, on average, having the most amount of bacterial leaf streak. So my interpretation of this, it's a statewide disease. It can creep up on you, even in an area that you may have not seen it before. Part of that has to be explained as we know it's carried in the seed. How many total acres? So I mentioned that we looked how many fields we had and how much was within field. So using those 2 values, at our highest, we're somewhere between 250 to 350,000 acres. Doesn't seem like a whole lot when we're maybe thinking about 6 million acres of wheat, but I'll tell you where we can start thinking about this a little bit differently in the economic assessment. So if we know that it's prevalent and we know it's on those acres, next challenge, how much yield loss is it actually causing? So to do this, we had a couple natural outbreaks in 2 variety trials, one in Steele County and one just south of Grand Forks. Had 42 to 44 hard red spring wheat varieties. And when it comes to documenting yield loss in bacteria, it's difficult. In funguses like scab or rust or tan spot, it's easy. You spray and you don't spray, right, on a variety. Bacteria, I don't have that luxury. I don't have anything I can spray to keep something clean. So the comparison point here is I was looking at the top yielding varieties, so the top quarter, and more or less generating percent loss based off resistance score. So if this is a little bit complicated, here's the simplified version of this. So here's the yield loss combined to the data across 4 locations. Yield loss meaning anything that falls above 0, you didn't see a yield loss. Anything that went below and then a negative, we saw yield loss. And how I grouped these was based off the hard red spring wheat BLS score, 1 being resistant, 9 being susceptible, okay? So moving left to right. So what did we find? Well, probably not surprising, the more susceptible varieties, you start seeing more yield loss. You also notice that even within a resistance score, there tends to be some variability as well. If somebody says, what is the worst case scenario from a yield loss aspect for using a really susceptible variety? I'll draw your attention to these 2 points. I think there were 54 and 59% yield loss in those plots, okay? Good thing is both those varieties are no longer on the market because of this reason. Okay? But if you want to think about a variety selection tool, you have a lot of, you look at a variety, you see all the disease, you see the yield, you see the protein, you see the quality. What do I recommend for something that has a BLS score? 5 or less. I think at that point is when we start to see that yield loss really start to fall off. We still got to dive into this a little bit more because, we do have some varieties that behave a little bit differently, and we're able to try to help unravel that just a little bit more in our field research. So we know how prevalent it is. We know some yield loss potential. Well, here's my best at being an economist for the day and trying to quantify yield loss. So fair warning, I did my best, but I'm a plant pathologist. Just remember that. So I went to the variety survey data that we have in North Dakota. grouped all of the varieties on the BLS score, on the acres they covered, and then I developed yield loss estimates from the previous 2 data sets on 2019 and 2020. And remember I said it's about 250,000 to 350,000 acres. Depending on the year, it could be about 1 million to 5 million or 1.3 to 8 million. Wide range, I understand that. But what I worry about is we're hitting millions of dollars of loss and we're on the fraction of the acres that was actually impacted. So that's why we can't fall asleep on bacterial leaf streak, because once we do have a bigger problem with it, we start to run into more yield loss concerns. Okay, doom and gloom is done. So what can we do about it? Okay, I mentioned this is the 6th time I'll mention host resistance and the importance of host resistance. If you're familiar with the hard red or the NDSU hard red spring wheat guide that Claire King puts together, our most important management tool is host resistance. I cannot express that enough. And based off that previous data, instead of me just saying 5 or less, this is where I'm able to actually apply it. Look at your varieties. If you're concerned about bacterial leaf streak, put it in that 5 or less category. So what does the landscape look like on current wheat acreage? I just took the popular varieties again off the wheat survey from 2022. Variety listed here, BLS score listed here, and the acres covered. About 50% of our acres are above the 5. Doesn't make, it kind of makes me a little bit nervous. But the good thing is we do have some really good varieties out there that have some decent host resistance. For example, our spring wheat breeder at NDSU, he just got approved for a new release that'll be in a couple years, but ND Thresher, the hallmarks of that variety is going to be bacterial leaf streak resistance. So it's something that we're actively looking at, we're actively concerned about, because if we're looking about, if I'm saying host resistance is our most important management tool, when that seed goes into the ground, there's your management, right? Your genetics are being relied on at that point. If you want to see what I look at every year in variety trials and how I score this, so if I'm saying the most resistant variety on the market, which we would call a 2 to 3, our standard is a variety called Boost. It's a South Dakota line. Not very popular, but has really great genetics for bacterial leaf streak. That variety can still get some flag leaf damage, but you'll see in a series of photos it's significantly less than what we see with something that's a 5 or 6. That's kind of in that, you're starting to see that coloring a little bit more. And with the worst case scenarios is those 8 or 9s, kind of going back to that other previous photo where your flag leaves are gone. Bottom leaves look fairly okay, but those flag leaves are completely burnt up. Okay, so that's putting the visual. So if I say 5 or less and you go out in your fields and you still see bacterial leaf streak, it's because we don't have complete resistance. Okay, the last question I'm going to talk about is, can I spray? This has been a fun challenge over the last couple years. Bacterial diseases, I work on another one called Goss's wilt in corn. Same strategy is we try to open up what I call the Disney vault and see what's out there, what's been labeled in citrus, what's been labeled in wheat, other small grains, to see if there's anything out there that can help manage a bacterial disease. So what I'm going to share with you today is we got funding from the North Dakota Wheat Commission, and I had an excellent PhD student in Leanne Lux. And what I did is combine 4 field trials from the last 3 years, and what they were set up as is we had 5 varieties, Boost, Vit Pro Velda, CP3910, and Rockford. So think of this as being the most resistant, that 5 to 6 category, and somewhere in the 8s, okay? Range of susceptibility, see if, an application of a bactericide is gonna help. So our bactericide that we use, so think of this as spraying some of the plots with Mastercop, which is copper sulfate pentahydrate. It's labeled, it's really marketed for a bactericide. We sprayed it at 16-ounce rate at flag leaf stage. So 5 varieties, spray and not spray. Simple as that. So what did we find? First, looking at disease levels. So don't pay attention to these really high numbers. This is just our way of trying to quantifying disease throughout the season. But here's your disease check, so you're non-sprayed, and here's your sprayed with Mastercop. Little bit of disease reduction, little bit, but if I'm living in a world of fungicides where I want to see big differences, this looks really insignificant because it was. What about the yield? If you want to look at the yield aspect, about a 2 bushel difference. but none of this was significant. All of this was a lot of noise in the data too. I got asked a question to see if the variety responses were different in terms of, if you sprayed it on a certain variety, susceptible, resistant, did you see a trend? And the trend was that what you're seeing up here. We see a little bit here in disease reduction, a little bit of yield, but nothing that I would consider to be significant or consistent enough from an application. So what are we looking at for moving forward? I'd say actively manage it. I'm not saying like next year we're going to have this huge bacterial leaf streak epidemic. That's something that I'm not saying, but something to be aware of, something that we might start seeing a little bit more of. And when it comes to management in season, don't think about managing it in season, thinking about next year. Thinking about that variety selection you're going to use. Really start asking those questions. 5 or less is the tool right now that we use. And as far as anything else on the horizon, I got asked a question yesterday. Out of those other trials where we evaluated 24 treatments to see if we can manage this disease in field, we sprayed it twice. We used a whole portfolio of, you name it, we haven't found anything yet. Okay? So that's the message today. I have a breakout session too that I apologize, we're going to look at bacterial leaf streak in person at the same time. So if you have any questions, please let me know now, or you can find me later during the breakout.
Any hope on seed treatment? You said that's our inoculum right there.
Yeah, good question. Question is, can we use a seed treatment? We are just putting our foot in the water in this realm. Previous research that's been done in Idaho suggests that it's not a consistent management tool, but we have maybe a few products that might look. For example, there's some probably safer copper formulations that aren't so phytotoxic on the seed. There are some biologicals that have maybe some potential, but I don't have any data yet. We're looking into it, but I will say this with my optimism, is just keep your expectations conserved in a little ways. Yeah, so the question is, mention Idaho and what they looked at. And so the one is streptomycin sulfate has been common, or has been labeled in the past in dry beans. They did not use that one. That's one that we are including in our trial. Most of the Idaho treatments were copper-based and heat treatment. They did find that heat treatment can kill the bacteria, but being able to commercialize an efficient and cost-effective way to treat thousands of bushels of seed might be a little bit difficult. But if you want to think about it as phytosanitary protection, breeders will often use heat treatment to kill the bacteria on the seed.
What percentage of the flag leaf damage show yield reduction?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the percentage of the flag leaf does it have to be damaged to show yield reduction? I don't have like a number on it, but how I look at this is like even in a resistant variety, for example, in some of our trials last year that had like 5% of the flag leaf damage, we're still seeing a little bit of a yield hit. So when you think about a flag leaf in general, most important leaf, any type of damage to that is going to cause some of the yield loss. Where it becomes more problematic is you get 50% of the flag leaf burnt up by the disease, and the rest of the leaf decides to die because it's no longer being able to support that. So I say any level of damage, but just be mindful. The other thing too, if you want to think about yield loss in a field, we see this disease in pockets. We don't see like this mass field of a problem, but you can start estimating pretty quickly how many pockets you see in a field and start doing some back of the envelope math.
We hunted for quite a while to find something that would increase resistance or tolerance to scab over the last few decades. Other than Boost and now Thresher from Dr. Green's program, what do we have for germplasm tools to tap into to look for that kind of resistance?
Yes, it's a good question. So what is our germplasm? Where's our resistant pool, right? I can't say for 100% sure, but most of the programs have been looking at Boost for some parent material. There are some efforts looking at triticale, has a natural resistance to this, but it takes a little bit longer to incorporate that into a wheat variety. And there are some varieties on the market that, like I think Trigger is another one that looks pretty good as far as as having host resistance. So it's floating around there, but it becomes that delicate balance of BLS resistance with scab resistance with yield, right? It's just, that's why I'm a pathologist and not a breeder, and that's the biggest reason why. Yeah, so the question is, if you have a lot of bacterial leaf streak in the field, what do you do next year? I think if you have significant levels and you know that variety is pretty susceptible, change the seed source. The one way that we can fight our way out of bacterial diseases is changing up that host resistance. And I usually encourage it. If it's enough of a concern questioning it, probably making that decision to switch out the seed lot would be important.
Andrew, how farmers can find the variety comparison information? Where do they go for that?
So where do you find the variety information? Claire, I might look at you, but is it the best way just to Google 2022 NDSU Hardwood Spring Wheat Guide, variety guide?
Yep, and I brought copies. I think it's a pink cover on the table out front, like a hard copy.
All right, so yeah, perfect. We have a dedicated, always dedicated individual, right?
Grab some.
Yeah.
Leak sanitation and equipment. Have you seen anything where transporting the bacteria coming off the equipment going to seed or
So you think of traffic through a field, is that kind of the question, and the spread of bacteria? I don't think it's as sensitive as what we see with pathogen transfer like in potatoes sometimes, but what I have noticed that in wheel tracks, irrigated tracks, tend to see some damage occur earlier and more at higher levels because bacteria is favored by any type of damage. It's just not like you walking through a field and kicking it around. It still needs a little help at the end of the day, but something to be aware of, but not field transfer, I should say. Okay, so the equipment itself. You know, it's likely it could be carried. The one good thing about bacteria, it has a shelf life, but it's not as long as some of the fungal diseases. So I don't have anything specific on data that would say, what is that risk point? Something to be aware of, but as far as a biology thing, we have a little bit of a head, kind of a leg up when it comes to any type of transfer like that. I think I'm going to get cut off here.
No, you still have time for.
Oh, just kidding.
One
any other
or
questions?
two questions.
Andrew, is mode of infection systemic or is it aerial?
So mode of infection, so is it systemic or aerial? So what it will do, it does travel like in the xylem tissue on a leaf, right? But it relies on the ooze to get to another plant part. So it won't go down, up through the stem, up to the head. It's going to be more of a splash dispersing type of mechanism. And somebody asked me one time, like, what about on the seed? To the best of our knowledge, that bacteria will survive on the seed, then kind of sit on the coleoptile and kind of hang out, and then kind of wait for that infection event, like a damage, before to get into the host tissue. But that's one kind of black box that we're trying to unravel at the moment. Good question, Greg. I didn't expect anything less.
So damage, wind, slight hail, what do you?
Yeah, so the damage factor. Wind, sandblasting, hail, yes, all the above. Really, I've seen it on the northwest corner of a field, almost kind of moving in. I've seen it erupt more frequently on a susceptible variety after a little bit of hail, dinging up the flag leaves. So there's anything that's just enough to get that, really small cells into the leaf tissue.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.